Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Let's get right to it. I am so happy to be joined again by Greg Lukianoff. Greg Lukianoff is an attorney, New York Times bestselling author, and the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. He is the author and co-author of several books, most recently of The Canceling of the American Mind, Cancel Culture Undermines Trust and Threatens Us All, but There is a Solution. That's what we talked about last time Greg joined us. He also released The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail earlier this summer. There you go. If you watch it on the video, there it is.
Yeah. Most importantly, with the great Nadine Strawson, the former president of the ACLU, who's one of my heroes.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. The collaborations are incredible. Your co-authors, I mean, there's a Hall of Famer and future Hall of Famers right there.
Yeah, no, I love. I've been asked, it's like, are you ever going to write a book by yourself? I'm like, why would I do that? like, think about the co-authors I've been able to have. But I might at some point.
You know, Paul McCartney never had a number one hit on his own.
Really?
Yeah, it was either with the Beatles or
with Wings,
with Michael Jackson or with some other collaborator. So there's something to be said for that.
Interesting.
So finally, Greg is the executive producer of a couple different feature-length documentaries. Frankly, I can't keep up with how prolifically, what is the word for it? Ubiquitous this dude is. But I'm just so glad you're back. How you doing, by the way, man?
I'm a little under the weather, to be honest.
Okay.
I just found out that I've been doing like a ton of media, and my brain is swimming a little bit. But it makes me a little looser. So
Okay.
Like maybe the Sudafed when it starts hitting.
Yeah, don't think I'm going to go easy on you, man. I thought we'd kind of reset and learn a little bit about you for folks who hadn't listened the first time around or maybe not as familiar. What first piqued your interest in subjects like the law in general or freedom of speech more specifically, and like all that you ended up doing now with Foundation Individual Rights and Expression?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, a great question. One, I'm a first generation American. Both my parents are foreign. My dad was fleeing the Bolsheviks. My dad's old. My dad's 99. And so I definitely grew up with that in my personal story. But even the neighborhood I grew up in, were a lot of other kids who were fleeing, Vietnam, fleeing China, fleeing Korea, fleeing authoritarianism in South America. So we had this, and I mean, it's funny, like sometimes like people don't really understand like how intense kind of like immigrant pride can actually be. And we, in some ways, like we take America's promise more seriously than anybody else. And the free speech thing, we know, all of us knew from family history is very unique, and it's something to be very proud of. And when I heard about, actually, this relates to this. FIRE is working with the ACLU, and we are reissuing Ari Nair's Defending My Enemy. Ari Nair is a Holocaust survivor, of the tattoos and everything. And he was one of the people defending the Nazis at Skokie in the late 1970s.
So he was one of the attorneys with the ACLU?
He was the head of the ACLU at the time.
Yeah.
And he that's how principled he was. And for kids like me and like the kids I grew up with, we just thought that was amazing. I'm like, this is principled. These people really mean it. That the Jewish lawyers are willing to defend the rights of Nazis even though they despise them. So we're reissuing this with the ACLU because it's this excellent book, and it was out of print called Defending My Enemy. And that kind of stuff made a real impression on all of us, and so freedom of speech. And then I also grew up, as a kid in the 80s and like a teenager in the 90s. Not a bad combination in my opinion. Honestly, kind of like the free speech law was improving, people's appreciation for free speech, and the polling, both right and left, was improving during that time. So for a lot of my life, the free speech always just seemed like one of the greatest goods, and it needed to be protected and defended. And when it comes to law school, I wasn't all that interested in law school. I was people would tell me that I should be a lawyer because they perceived that I liked to argue, and I was always like, no, I don't actually like to argue. I just have very strong opinions and
Yeah.
principles on a lot of these things. I don't enjoy it. But it was really actually when two things happened. Oh, actually, one story I can't. I don't think I can tell.
Oh,
One
please do.
maybe I can. I think I maybe told this on another thing. Is my brother got arrested for armed bank robbery in the 1990s by the LAPD. He had nothing to do with it, to be clear,
Okay.
nothing to do with it. But he got arrested, and he was held for longer than they're allowed to under the Constitution. And we were a poor family. Like we didn't know what to do. We actually got help from Jamie Raskin. Back when he was a professor at University of, at Washington College of Law at American University, we got help from him to find my brother a lawyer. But otherwise, we wouldn't have known what to do. And that feeling of helplessness is
Yeah.
one of the things that really convinced me I wanted to go to law school. Our family needed someone who could stand up for them, like if we were getting pushed around again. But the cause that made me want to go to law school was freedom of speech. I
Mm.
wanted to go to study freedom of speech. I want to go defend it. I was really interested, particularly in free speech online, for example. And there were some big issues coming out of the Communications Decency Act at the time.
Oh,
Yeah.
was this wasn't as far back as 94? Was it 94 or 96? I'm
The,
trying. How far
yeah.
back was this?
It was the Telecommunications Act of 1995, and I think
Okay.
it passed in 96. And the Communications Decency Act was an attempt to ban indecency on the internet,
Right, right, right.
which is not the same thing as banning obscenity, for example, which isn't protected speech, even in the United States. And obscenity is essentially like hardcore pornography,
Right.
like really hardcore pornography. But indecency is just whatever you think is indecent. Like there's no legal meaning to that. And I knew this was laughably unconstitutional. And that really made me want to go to law school to study the First Amendment. The other thing was working for the student newspaper. Because if you work for the student newspaper, you get to see with your own eyes how much, no matter how people talk about liking freedom of speech, they want you to punish that one reporter or remove that one article, or and it's usually almost always personal, like essentially like you went after my friend, and
Mm.
therefore that reporter should be fired, and having to be like, no, I can't fire that reporter, like because I was an editor at the student newspaper. So all of these combined to have this deep passion for freedom of speech. So I went to law school. I took every class that Stanford offered on. My staff is sick of hearing this, but it's true. Every class that they offered on First Amendment freedom of speech. When I ran out, I designed my own independent study on censorship during the Tudor dynasty.
Oh,
I interned at the ACLU, and even though I worked at a patent law firm for the first year after I graduated law school, it was while I was at the same time looking for a full-time First Amendment job.
okay.
Um, and it actually came to me because like the dean of the law school knew that this was my passion. And when Harvey Silverglate, the co-founder of FIRE, went looking for someone to be the first legal director of FIRE, they found me. Now, my only complaint there is I had this totally dope life in San Francisco, and then I moved to Philadelphia where I wasn't quite as happy. Um, but the job itself, the proof is in the pudding, and that I've been doing this now for almost 24 years.
Oh man. Um, the the idea that San Francisco versus Philadelphia, I know both of those cities quite well. And while I Bucks County is one of my favorite places in the universe, Philly versus San Francisco, I mean, I understand.
And
Anyway,
to be clear, man, it's not just San Francisco. It's San Francisco in the late 90s.
yeah,
Um,
okay, okay.
I was like in the Burning Man group. Like now people talk about Burning Man all the time. I'm like, I went when it was cool. You youngins
Right.
going now. There's like a monorail there now. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's so much that you said there that I want to dig in on. But one thing that I was unaware of until I read War on Words, I should have known this.
What?
But that is, I think it was argument 10 about the Holocaust.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Why we should the argument is why we should censor hateful and extremist speech. What I didn't know was that in the 1920s, as you describe it in the book War on Words, the Weimar Republic had bans on hate speech targeted
Yeah,
specifically at Nazis' anti-Semitic language, and it was counterproductive.
yeah,
Could you spell a little bit more about that out for us? And then
yeah.
fast forward to the 1930s when the Nazis were actually in power.
Yeah, what the audience, needs, like the background that the audience knows here is that for the advocates of like newfangled speech codes, including one of the most passionate advocates for this, Richard Delgado, someone I actually debated at Williams way back in 2003, they fall back on this argument all the time that hate speech laws are good because hate speech laws would have stopped the Nazis.
Hmm.
Um, and I also think this is a ridiculous argument, even without knowing the specific details, because it's like, well, the Nazis were elected, to be clear, and they were voted for by the kind of people who would vote for Nazis. So I don't think it would be as secure as you would think. Laws aren't self executing. But then when you look into it some more, and this was something where I was first made aware of it in a book called Tyranny of Silence by Fleming Rose, it actually turns out Nazis were prosecuted for saying anti-Semitic things. That Nazis went to jail for
Right.
saying anti-Semitic things, and when they got out of jail, Hitler and the Nazis turned it into a big PR PR event, being like, "We must be right because you're censoring us," was basically the way they explained it. They even had a poster of Hitler with tape on his mouth saying that of 2 billion Germans, only one is not allowed to speak. Sorry, I have 2 billion people on the earth. Sorry, which is funny just to remember the earth was that small back then. But of 2 billion people on the earth, only one is not allowed to speak on German campuses. And that was because after Hitler tried to overthrow the government in a violent coup, and the beer hall putsch in 22, 23. Anyway, but he tried to overthrow the German government,
Right.
and he was given a slap on the wrist essentially for it, and only went to jail, only served about 2 years, I think, 2 or 3 years. But
No, he served 8 months.
was it really that little?
I think it was 8 months. Yeah.
Wow. So
But to your point, if I may,
yeah.
the distinction there though is that while freedom of speech is a virtue that should be defended, even especially when we disagree with it, what he was arrested for was actual violence,
Actual violence.
right? That was then just a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I make that point is just to say, like, listen, I think the world would be a better place if they hung him, like they usually did for sedition back then.
Yeah.
For trying to overthrow the government. I say that unapologetically. But at the same time, the distinction that the Weimar Republic, so it's a myth. It's called the Weimar fallacy.
Right.
It's a myth that Weimar was very protective of free speech. They simply were not. Speech was highly regulated under Weimar. People are pointing to like the fact that Berlin was highly tolerant of, as seen in Cabaret, which it was.
Yeah.
But that's not the same thing as saying that they don't have, good, terrible laws on freedom of speech. But what they were highly tolerant of in Germany was right-wing violence. And if they had decided they wanted to stop the Nazis dead in their tracks, they had a lot of options to, just by enforcing law against murder, for
Yeah.
example.
This
So
is the distinction that I come up against time and again, whether it's friends of mine who are defending, for example, the looting and the graffiti and the burning
yeah,
of Waymos here in LA.
yeah.
Um, you know,
Don't burn those poor robots.
seriously, but I mean, there's the distinction as I've come to understand it is the time, place, and manner restrictions, appropriate time, place, and manner restrictions. While I am at odds with a lot of the folks who were chanting from the river to the sea, I have family in Israel. Of course, I'm against it, but
Sure.
I would defend vigorously their right to free speech within those time, place, and manner restrictions. Is that
Yeah.
the proper balance, or am I getting that a little bit off?
Oh, no, no, that is correct, but also a bright line distinction between speech and violence.
Right. Right.
that essentially, and I'm very, I say this a lot, particularly on campuses. Listen, you should have absolute tolerance for opinion in particular. Like I call myself an opinion absolutist, but you should not have any tolerance for violence.
Right.
And any time, and what's weird is watching some of these protests where people come to fire and basically talk like, well, yeah, sure, like we smashed some windows and we burned some stuff down, and maybe this one guy got hit, but and it's like we were protesting. And it's like, no, 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 no. Violence is not an extreme form of protest. Violence is the antithesis of what free speech is supposed to be for. Free speech is supposed to be for the peaceful resolution of things that we used to resort to violence for. Because most
Right.
of history is coercing conformity, coercing behavior through violence or the threat of violence, usually the threat of violence, but then a lot of times violence as well. And free speech is this wonderful way of dealing with deathly serious issues, matters
Yeah.
of life and death, without resort to violence. And as long as you actually have rules around it saying, like, listen, I'm going to make my argument, you should listen to me, and I'm going to address your argument. Something that's collectively called a culture of dignity, essentially.
Yeah.
Then you can actually it's an incredible way to, it's an incredible tool for peace, freedom of speech. Jonathan Rauch really likes to point this out. But at the same time, when people talk about, but people can be really cruel and the words can be hard. And I'm like, but they're replacing actual violence and combat and all of these things. And again, oftentimes we are debating life or death issues. So of
Yeah.
course it's going to be pretty harsh.
Yeah. And that's what, so I couldn't help but think of the January 6th offenders that were
Sure.
pardoned, how
Yeah.
pernicious of an action that was.
Yes,
Um,
agreed.
but I knew I would do this. I got way out of order here. I need to ask you about the New York Times article. The title could have been, "We hate this guy, but maybe he was right." I couldn't help but think like, but here's what I don't understand is there is there just a blindness to that balance? I mean, talk about the First Amendment. The very first passage in the First Amendment is that balance between the free expression clause and the Establishment Clause, right?
Yeah.
So there's that balance, and but there are so many folks. I've experienced this literally in the last 24 hours, where folks don't realize that they are not arguing for a virtue like our First Amendment freedoms or the freedoms articulated throughout the Bill of Rights,
Mhm.
versus arguing for their ideal, their particular position that would then be under attack if somebody else is in power. So
Yeah.
that's what I was reading throughout that article. But I'll let you kind of summarize what there is a lot there. So forgive me for filibustering a little bit about this,
Oh
but
no, 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 no. So we had this article that I actually considered quite good about fire come out in the New York Times, and believe me, I was anxious about it because we have not been treated very well by the New York Times
yeah,
in the past. We had an article one time referring to us as conservative. Then Steve Pinker, Ira Glasser, former head of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson, all like wrote in saying, "No, that's nonsense. Like, look at how consistent they are." I've written a little bit about some of the bad experiences I've had with the New York Times over the years, but we launched this lawsuit against Marco Rubio's power to kick any non-citizen out. Pretty much in his infinite discretion.
yeah,
Like there's one part of the law that says if it's found to be adverse to foreign policy, which is certainly pretty broad too, but then there's another provision that basically doesn't even limit it that way.
yeah.
And that's how you end up with cases like the Ramesa Ozturk case, who was a student here on a student visa. She wrote an op-ed saying that Trump should divest from Israel. Not something I agree with, but a fairly mainstream opinion on campus. And she was the one that the other video of her being stuffed into a van and
Mm,
flown to Louisiana. That was all on the basis of Rubio's power. So we launched a lawsuit challenging that. And by the way, the one time that policy has been challenged, it was ruled unconstitutional by Trump's sister.
oh, that's
Uh,
right.
yeah, no, it's it's one of these things where it's like, yeah, we got some good authority on our sides on that one. But anyway, so we wrote that, and then we got contacted by the New York Times, who was kind of talking about it like this was some kind of change in the way we'd been, and we were like, no, we've always been like this. Like we've always taken on right and left. It's just, if other people have been paying attention to that. But definitely, but one thing that is true is that since the beginning of the Trump administration, since we've been taking on the right a lot more than the left, as we have like in other years, there are people who stopped donating to us and got really mad at us because they, in their opinion, Trump is fighting kind of like wokeness essentially, and it's like, listen, that's not our issue. Our issue is freedom of speech. So when someone comes from the left and wants to stop freedom of speech, we will oppose them, and someone comes from the right as well. But I'd say the only thing that kind of stuck in my craw a little bit about the article was just, and this wasn't the reporter's fault. This happens all the time with headlines. It said something like suddenly,
Suddenly.
yeah, suddenly like we're taking these kind of cases. And my point was like we've always been like this since
Yeah.
day one. The secret model is we'd rather drive this bus into a wall than be unprincipled.
Oh, that's that philosophical quandary that's asked, right? Do you run somebody over or crash into a wall?
Oh, nice. No, no, that actually just comes from an image that I said one time. So when Fire was very young, when Fire was when I was only there for like a month, we had a case involving a professor named Sami Al-Arian. The accusation against Sami Al-Arian was that Sami Al-Arian had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood that were illegal, like basically ties to foreign terrorism. But rather than fire him for that, University of South Florida decided to fire him for saying in a video from 1989, and this is 2001, death to Israel. Again, not speech I like,
Yeah.
but who cares? And they weren't willing to say, and what they were willing to say behind closed doors, they were afraid that maybe that whitewashing report that University of South Florida did, glossing over, he probably does have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. They didn't want to admit they were wrong on that. And in these private conversations, we were like, that's not our issue here. Like
Yeah.
if you're firing him for protected speech, even if it's offensive protected speech, but also from 12 years ago, the we that's not okay, and we will always fight you on that. And we held the line, and then he was eventually arrested for ties to terrorism. And it was very
Mm,
funny to have some people be like, "See," and it's like we've been saying since day one, if
right.
he's guilty of an actual crime, charge him with an actual crime. And eventually they did. But when that case started, this was right after 9/11. We're a tiny little nonprofit. There's like six of us in the office in total. And we were asked, like, I called Sami Al-Arian to see if he needed representation, kind of almost hoping he wouldn't call back. And he called back. And we were like, okay, I guess we're defending this guy. And that was I'd rather drive this bus into a wall than be unprincipled. That's where the secret motto of Fire came from.
Mm.
Because we thought it would, we thought it would destroy us. And we did lose a lot of donors when we were very small, but it didn't quite destroy us. And, we're still alive and kicking today.
Still driving the bus, but not quite
Yeah.
into a wall.
Yeah. But we will if we have to.
We will if we have to. I thought the book, The War on Words, was really helpful. But I found the exercise that I was going through was to try to first understand the arguments that you're arguing against, that
Yeah.
you and your co-writer were arguing against. When Yasha Monk, when his book came out, The
Yeah.
Identity Trap, he does that really well in all of his chapters, where he really thoroughly articulates folks that he's got. Well, it's Ibram X. Kendi or the 1619 Project. He thoroughly articulates that. Now, obviously, we're not going to get into all 10, but I thought it would be a good exercise if we started maybe just with the first one. What is the argument that words are violence? Let's start there, and then we'll, describe your response to that.
Well, okay, there's different forms of it. And one of them's entirely ancient, is that it's arbitrary to draw a line between what we do with our mouths, what we do with our tongues, and what we do with our bodies. In a sense, we're doing it with our body no matter what. And that you could hurt people both ways. And indeed, you could hurt people more severely by challenging their reputations,
Mm,
by hurting their dignity or their pride. And that is a central assumption in, I think I mentioned a culture of dignity,
Yeah.
in what's called a culture of honor, which is kind of like the dominant moral sort of structure that preceded a democratic culture of dignity, where essentially, to a degree, it's up to you to defend your honor, your reputation, all that kind of stuff, which means that's how you have dueling. That's how you have, people getting arrested for, saying something bad about the king. This is very old fashioned. So in a sense, it's just a really, really old argument. But students on campus making this argument don't realize that they're making a 13th century BC argument. Like it's like, oh, that's cute. You thought no one came up with that one before. But the more sophisticated version of it was made by Lisa Barrett Feldman in the New York Times.
I think it's the other way, Feldman Barrett. Yeah.
Is it Feldman Barrett? Yeah.
I
Okay.
might be wrong. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But she's a psychologist and well respected. But she made the argument that because words can have a physiological effect on us, because it produces a stress response that can be harmful to us, the distinction between words and violence is essentially arbitrary. And Haidt and I wrote in response to this, in the Atlantic, saying, "Don't tell." Well, I think the title of it is like, "Don't tell kids that there's no distinction between words and violence," just because it's also terrible advice, but also challenging the idea that's like what you're saying is that words are violence because both can be physiologically harmful because words can produce a stress response.
Mm.
Well, guess what? Everything can produce a stress response to some degree. And that essentially the idea that everything that produces a stress response can be illegal doesn't make sense. Because I mean, like nobody would ever want, "I don't love you anymore," to be illegal to say to somebody.
Yeah.
But what could produce a worse stress response than something true like that? So we pointed out how that's not a persuasive argument. And then I always like when people think they've discovered this idea that it's essentially a social construct, like in the sense of like we've made a decision societally to draw this very bright line distinction between words and violence. And then they make that argument, then they jump to, and since it's arbitrary, like who cares? We don't need it. And it's like, no. It is a distinction. It is a societal decision, like most things are. The whole intersubjective reality idea is absolutely true. That essentially, yeah, we made a societal decision to draw a bright line distinction, but it's one of the smartest inventions for civilization in human history. It protects innovation. It keeps people safe, as we said before, by allowing an outlet that doesn't resort to violence. It has it creates peace, prosperity, all of these things, innovation. It's a brilliant distinction. But as soon as you start blurring the line between speech and violence, you quite literally doom us to a cycle of violence. Because what was happening, and this was partially in response to when Milo Yiannopoulos, who's a right-wing bomb thrower, tried to speak at Berkeley in 2017. A giant angry mob that smashed windows and hit some dude with a flagpole should have killed him, honestly. Like we talk about this in Coddling the American Mind. It was bad. And this riot essentially happened by the time, like the most of the riot happened by the time Milo had actually already been evacuated, essentially. And the victims of it weren't even necessarily people there who were there to see the talk. But then, and that was bad enough. Then there hadn't been like that kind of violence in response to speech since probably the 1970s. So it was a big watershed moment. But what was the scariest about it was that the student newspaper at Berkeley that, did an issue where there was like 5 different op-eds or columns from students making the point defending the riot and consistently coming back to the idea that Milo's words were violence, so our violence was self-defense. And I know that sounded like at some level sort of clever to the students writing it, but it's like, okay, here's the thing. If both sides think that your words are violence and my words and my violence is self-defense, then you're going to be in a downward spiral for violence. Even if only one side thinks that,
Right.
you're going to be in a spiral for violence because basically, like someone says something, you said that's violence, I get to hit you, and then that person is considered to legitimately have the right to hit back. So it's just it's it's a rhetorical flourish that feels emotionally powerful, dressed up like it's a serious, new, and innovative argument, but it carries a lot of power. And
Yeah.
you'll see this. I gave a TED talk where I talk about, words not being violence.
Now, there's one that requires a little bit of nuance to understand the distinction. The argument for about shout downs,
Oh, sure,
where
yeah, yeah.
audience members have attempted to shout down events and keep them from proceeding. Um, so one could argue that shout downs are an expression of free speech,
Yeah.
but why is that? Why is that wrong?
Well, because going back to the to sort of ancient history, going back to the history of the entire species, the most common way for someone to be censored in human existence, isn't authority to send forces there to stop you. It's that the people hearing the talk either intimidate you out of giving it, or make you run away, or otherwise prevent other people from hearing it. Like
Hmm.
that's the most ancient form of sort of like tribal censorship,
Yeah.
and the way it's usually enforced. So mob censorship is in some ways like our most basic kind of censorship. And it's important for people to understand that, and when we talk about this on campus, it's like, well, we didn't want that person here. And so we shouldn't have to listen to him. It's like, okay, you're blurring a couple things here. One, you never had to listen to him.
Yeah,
You,
that's right. You could choose not to go.
you could choose not to go, or you could protest outside. But you're not speaking for the people who actually showed up for the talk. Actually, what you're saying to them is you troglodytes cannot hear him because I don't want you to. And that's really functioning as a classic censor. So mob censorship is not okay. Like getting people to get now, there is a distinction to be drawn here. We've defended these cases. There have been attempts to punish people for holding banners in the back of a talk, for example, and we're like, no, that's non-disruptive. They can do that, or even some amount of booing and hissing. People have been punished for that. We're like, nope, that's okay. But if your goal is to prevent other people from hearing this talk, that's mob censorship. And it's even worse. And I talk about an example when I open my TED talk about this, when you resort to violence to try to shut down that talk. Like that's right out. You should be kicked out of school for that, because that is not compatible with the way it's supposed to work. So mob censorship is something that I take very seriously. And unfortunately, 2023 and 2024 was the largest number of campus shout downs of speakers that we've seen, with several of them involving actual violence as well.
Yeah, and threats, not beyond intimidation, but
Yeah.
threats of violence to
Yeah.
kids just walking across campus to their classes. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that happened to a lot of Jewish students, like across the country, where there would be, people actually setting up the like checkpoints, like stopping Jewish students. The argument was that they were simulating what it's like to be in Gaza, and it's like, but that doesn't give you the right to actually stop your fellow students, when they're trying to get from point A to point B, particularly if you're doing it on a discriminatory basis. Like
yeah,
that's not okay.
yeah, yeah. There are some great quotes in there. Frederick Douglass, the one from Thurgood Marshall, I took note of. Thurgood Marshall, in a Supreme Court opinion in 1972, said the freedom to speak and the freedom to hear are inseparable. They are two sides of the same coin, but the coin itself is the process of thought and discussion. I have to admit that I've evolved in the last couple of years on this. I had some loose rules on conversations that I was curating
Yeah.
that disinformation and misinformation, for example. I was basically following the Facebook rules of
Yeah.
2020, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, hate speech will be reported and all that. But I've gone a little bit. I've corrected course by uh, leaning heavily into allowing speech to stand, even the most objectionable speech. Uh, you know, so it's something that I just have to grapple with. There's a line somewhere, and I can't really put my finger on exactly where it is. But misinformation and disinformation, I'll allow to stand now, because I think I was wrong in the past for muting it or deleting it from my threads. So
Yeah.
I guess it's something that we all have to grapple with and really understand, the core principles. One that I don't think I still understand yet, though. I've heard Sarah Isker talk about the misunderstanding of the crowded theater, which you deal with
Oh
in
yeah,
Opening
yeah,
Seven.
yeah. Yep.
Now, I read the historical context that is related to an early 1900s Supreme Court case, right?
Yeah.
But why are people, including me, so why is there so much misunderstanding about it? And what is it actually? What's the right way to think about that analogy?
So, Fire in a Crowded Theater is a zinger from the great wordsmith Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., whose father was actually a famous writer, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., and so the guy was great intellectual and great with words. But it comes from an opinion that was justifying whether or not you could arrest socialists, communists, anarchists after World War II just for speech.
Mm,
So it comes from from a decision that would not be considered constitutional anymore. Like and what Holmes is saying is that of course we can ban speech. Would it just because we say it's protected, wouldn't it prevent you from falsely shouting fire in a theater such that it causes a riot? Um, and that is and frankly, like that's dicta for one thing, but it's not the law that actually maintained. Essentially, like he was likening that to people saying communist anarchist speech, which we all know now under First Amendment law is unquestionably protected. So like that even comes from like this was before Oliver Wendell Holmes went from being sort of a free speech villain to a free speech hero. Because before he actually kind of changed his ways, there's this great book called The Great Dissent that talks about how he changed his opinion basically over the course of one summer and became this great champion of freedom of speech after being quite critical of it. So the saying itself doesn't have real legal meaning. But it also usually gets shortened to just fire in a crowded theater. And what people when people say it, they use it so promiscuously. Like it's kind of like, well, like I know that people should be willing to accept insults, but don't you think calling me a jerk is like shouting fire in a crowded theater? And it's like, so we make these jokes like within fire, but like we see it get you abused all the time. That
right.
essentially like the idea that people and it's not even and the thing that's interesting is that you would need the scenario of falsely shouting is a big part of it,
Okay.
because like if you're actually saying there is a fire, and that sounds like a cheap like a kind of distinction, but it's not. Like the idea of like shouting fire, like when you're saying falsely, like the idea that like actually by all like one of the functions of free speech is to tell you what the world looks like. So by all means, that falsely is important, and that's such that it creates a panic in which implicitly, which was intentional, in which people get hurt. Now, I've never seen precisely that scenario in a case. If you had someone, it's an intentional plot, it's a crowded theater, the goal is to get people hurt, and people actually are hurt because someone shouted fire. That's a case that I'd be interested to see, but there hasn't been that decision yet. What
Mhm.
has happened is that, for example, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead.
Okay.
A famous play.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this Tom Stoppard. Love this play. It's so
Yeah, it's
wonderfully
great.
weird, and it's about these two side characters in Hamlet. And this thing has been showed tens of thousands of times, if not more. And it's a great play. Go ahead and see it if you can. It's weird, lovely. But one thing they do into that is they look at the crowd and they go, fire, with like as best as they can. It's like, and I think the line after is like, well, there goes that theory.
That's great. That's great. No, and there have been some very high profile debates that really explore this line. For example, at the Stop the Steal rally, there was a lot of examination of President. It was he still president? Yeah. So it was December of 2020. So he was still
Yeah,
President
yeah,
Trump at the time. President Trump's words. But there were two qualifiers there.
yeah,
Was he using his speech to incite violence based on, am I getting this right? Incite illegal acts
yeah,
based on knowingly false premises. Are
yeah.
those the two qualifiers? Do I have that right?
So the cases, the early case law that we're talking about, the Oliver Wendell Holmes era, is where we get our doctrines of incitement from. And the
Okay.
incitement doctrine used to be, as established by Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, a clear and present danger of like an imminent lawless act, essentially.
Yeah.
But this actually got changed in a case, and I think improved in a case called Brandenburg v. Ohio, and
Okay.
then it became, the an imminent likelihood of a lawless act occurring.
So
Like,
the example you use of what happened in Rwanda,
yeah,
where they went on radio,
yeah.
broadcast actual homes and addresses, and incited, literally incited,
Yeah,
not just violence but mass murder.
mass murder. Yeah, that would meet the incitement standard, or unless like I that would definitely meet it by its plain language. So it's a high standard,
Hmm.
and it's hard to meet. But I think for the most part, that's a good thing. Now, when it comes to the speech that Trump gave, the issue there is that, yeah, like the Brandenburg incitement standard was written for regular citizens, and putting like a very high bar. When it comes to Trump, in a more colloquial way, inciting violence, generally the punishment for that is supposed to be impeachment. It's supposed to be a political solution, to that, and that it wouldn't have reached the Brandenburg. It didn't quite reach the Brandenburg bar. It's about as close as I've ever seen, by the way, from a politician. But he did have qualifiers in there saying,
Yeah.
like, he did say peacefully,
Right.
and if you're saying go fight like hell and then you say peacefully, like, people are gonna like it, I'm sure people are saying they're being overly charitable to the interpretation. Now, of course, one of the things that was interesting was the extent to which it was intentional, whether or not it was part of a larger plan and or plot is also an issue that should have been handled, within the political system. And yeah,
Yeah. And now it's ironic, in tragic ways that the Trump administration is in so many cases on exactly the other side of that.
yeah,
Just things in the news. Well, I mean, current events, the
sure,
executive order about burning the flag, or the
yeah,
lawsuit against CBS, the
yeah.
lawsuit against Ann Seltzer.
The
There's
lawsuit against, like, it's funny because I had an interview with the Financial Times yesterday where I just tried to brush up on like what the latest Trump stuff was, and I just read this like list of things that we've been keeping track of, and one of them was the defamation suit against the Pulitzer board, because they gave a Pulitzer to like some Russiagate related things. And it's like, wow, like, it's been so bad that I'm forgetting these
right.
cases would have been like a year's worth of free speech news under a different administration.
And I think that's part of the point is
Yes,
to, yeah. Um,
absolutely.
Well, I could go through any number of these current events, but I guess I'll ask you this way: what concerns you the most? Is there anything that, I don't know, what concerns you the most about any of the actions the administration has taken so far in terms of threats to individual rights?
That's tough because because there's so many.
So much, yeah.
I would say that I've been saying a lot that I think one of the most underappreciated, because like there does seem to be a method to the madness. Like, Trump is a very, erratic personality, very, and I think that's one of the reasons why they actually lost their in the lawsuit that Harvard brought. Is that if you're trying to show that something is based on unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination, having the person having the president of the United States basically saying, "Yes, we're going after you for your viewpoint," is a great way to lose a case like that. So I think they've been stepping on their own feet in a lot of ways, but it's led to some some wins, for those of us who care about free speech. I feel like the least appreciated, though, part is the attacks on the law firms.
Mm,
I think that the idea that you would tell law firms that were simply adverse to the government in some cases, in some cases that Trump cared about, can be stripped of their security clearance and denied access to federal buildings, which of course includes courtrooms, is unprecedented. And it's a good thing that the law firms that have stood up are winning.
yeah.
I'm happy to report that's progress. I'm ashamed that a number of law firms haven't. They gave in, pretty fast. They didn't actually fight it. So I think that's like probably the least appreciated one. I would say, though, that it's It's just the try to figure out any lever you can use against your enemy's approach that is probably kind of the scariest. So the fact that he keeps on getting smacked down by courts of law, is good. But the
Yeah.
fact that they keep on, so when it comes to the Harvard case, and Harvard, by the way, like Harvard, we do a campus free speech ranking. Harvard very much earned its last place ranking for
Yeah.
2 years in a row. They're not great on academic freedom and free speech, and they're working on it. To be clear, then they have been making progress even before the Trump administration took over. So credit to them. I like what Alan Garber is doing. But that lawsuit, so we've been very critical of Harvard. But when the Trump administration decided to go after Harvard, they had one approach that was going after sort of anti-Semitism at Harvard, where I feel like if they followed the procedures that are in place that are guaranteed by Congress that you follow in the case of whether or not you can remove federal funding from Harvard for creating an anti-Semitic environment, I think there was a chance that Harvard would lose.
Mm,
They allowed some behavior that really kind of blurred the line about whether or not they would be found guilty of creating a hostile environment for Jewish students. The school, by the way, that was the most vulnerable by far was Columbia.
hmm.
So I'm not surprised at all that they settled fast.
Okay.
But then you have the whole argument that Harvard wasn't in compliance with Students for Fair Admissions, which got rid of affirmative action in higher ed, and like they were very vulnerable on that count too. So the government had a situation where they held some cards and to negotiate, with Harvard. But then in the process of doing it, they sent a letter to Harvard that essentially said, like as a way of like settling this case, the government will essentially take over curricular decisions, hiring decisions, admissions decisions, like basically like everything, like it's basically federalize effectively Harvard. And we're like, no, that's insane. We're civil libertarians here. You can't use a power that doesn't ever mention that Harvard can be brought into receivership for getting federal funding. That's nowhere in the code. So we very much defended Harvard for all of this. That was also something that the New York Times was impressed with, and it's like we've always been like this. But okay, I appreciate you're seeing it now.
Yeah.
But they also, and when I talk about every lever, one of the things that they tried, one of the many things that they tried, in trying to pressure Harvard to agree to this settlement agreement was they said that they were going to block any international students from getting visas to attend Harvard. And their argument there was that because a lot of national security, a lot of DoD, funding actually goes to schools like Harvard, and they didn't say this directly, but assuming Chinese nationals, for example, could be a security threat.
Right.
But here's the thing. If you're making that argument and then just banning them for Harvard, everybody knows what you're doing.
Right.
There are plenty of schools, including Stanford, that get tons of DoD funding. That like if that's seriously your argument, to say it looks fishy just do it to one school. It doesn't pass the laugh test. And so they got slapped down on that as well, which is good.
Yeah.
But but it was striking to be like you're really pulling out all the stops here, and also in some ways we're lucky that they decided to do it in such a foolish way to not act, because it could basically, if the president had said we're worried that some level of students that we're admitting are essentially spying for foreign powers. And therefore, we're limiting their access to schools that have big DoD funding. That probably is something within the executive's power to do, but we do it in such a transparently, like, really now this is just about, we're just going to flex our muscle against Harvard. You're really showing your cards. So the willingness to kind of try any lever of power at your disposal is really scary to me.
Am I wrong to have a little bit more confidence in the Supreme Court, specifically the justices that were appointed under the first Trump administration? They, if you read their opinions, they seem to have a much more. They're not as in the tank for Trump as a lot of folks would say.
Yeah.
And each one of them are different. I think when you take Amy Coney Barrett, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, And sometimes even Roberts. I know that he wasn't appointed under Trump, but Roberts gets thrown under the bus. They seem to have a much more independent, well, true conservative legal theory that guides them, and it's not necessarily ideological as many people are. You know it better than I do, but that's
Yeah.
what I'm seeing. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I got really uh, annoyed at like one thing that I was attending where I felt like there were a lot of people just kind of like, oh, basically the Supreme Court, like Trump owns the Supreme Court. And I
Yeah.
was like, no, he doesn't. Like the Amy Coney Barrett thinks for herself, Roberts thinks for himself, Gorsuch thinks for himself, and some others. I mean, actually, to be fair, Thomas completely thinks for himself. Just sometimes he tends to, he tends to very much agree with Trump on a lot of stuff. But yeah, he definitely, like those are his opinions for sure. But at the same time, yeah, there are cases that we've disagreed with the Supreme Court on so far this year, and some, some quite strongly. But at the same time, when we read the opinions, they're not. They're well reasoned. They actually make sense. They're oftentimes some of the cases that we knew we had a chance of losing. But
Yeah.
overall, they haven't been afraid to say no to Trump. I mean, there have been some pretty, serious issues that have come up where people were kind of shocked that the Supreme Court found in Trump's favor, where I was really shocked that anybody thought that they wouldn't, because it was a case that I thought even if it was in front of a less conservative court, the Supreme Court would have found in Trump's favor. So I think the cynicism about the Supreme Court is misplaced. I think the concern that it's very favorable to Trump uh, isn't, but I don't think it's wildly out of proportion to. I don't like the myth of it being of it just being in like Trump's pocket. I think is just incorrect.
Yeah. Now, this isn't necessarily in a purview of free expression, free speech, but the opinion on presidential immunity was the one that confounded me the most.
Yeah,
I know that it was narrower than a lot of folks who aren't as familiar with the court and
it
actual opinions, but
it
it's
it
still,
is it is substantially narrower than a lot of people think. But I get why people would be concerned about it.
yeah. So a couple big questions, and then we'll start to wrap up.
Mhm.
Do you think that we as a society have the antibodies or the resilience, whether it's through organizations like FIRE or ACLU, or our ability to self-correct, like institutions of higher learning, that we're seeing Harvard, Columbia, Penn make these or make efforts at least to course correct? Do you think that we as can be a culture that's faithful to enlightenment virtues of free speech, free expression within the pluralistic setting of a country like ours?
I think it's tough. I think that essentially, a lot of the virtues of kind of enlightenment, type thinking, they require a lot of people.
Yeah.
Like I named one of my books "Freedom from Speech," because I was always kind of blown away when I was studying like Russian history, reading the scholarship of the pro-czarist, intellectuals, making the argument that the Russian peasant has the best kind of freedom of all, which is the freedom
Freedom from
the
freedom.
from the burden of freedom, and it's like, wow, okay, but let's be clear, it's a burden. Like,
Yeah.
like the idea of like the of having to be autonomous and having to make your own decisions and to actually be informed and be a participant in your government. Like all of these things, these are challenges and these aren't easy. And that's the whole, a famous, possibly apocryphal Benjamin Franklin line: "A republic, if you can keep it." Like
Mm,
it takes work. And I think we are in serious trouble if neither right nor left actually are preaching these values anymore. And this is one of the things that I got worried that because I've always considered myself a liberal, but I've always had issues with the left,
yeah.
like essentially the people who want like a utopian form of government. Like I like liberalism personally, And that means, though, that you get taught a lot of, constitutional principles in a kind of skewed way that tends to be more negative, and a picture of like the amazing thing that was actually accomplished by the founders in a skewed way. And the conservatives used to be kind of like a counterbalance to that, oftentimes portraying things in a way that was too rosy, like for someone who's fairly serious on history like I am, but at the same time, like not as apocalyptic or as condemning as some of the Howard Zinn type approaches to constitutional government. But now on the right, like what we're seeing is you see people on the right now talking about like how Lenin was right. You got Bannon, like I think Bannon called himself a Leninist. I think Chris Rufo talks about like we agree with Lenin on power, and I'm like, okay. If left and right now are basically saying it's like really all that matters is power, it's like, you know what? That's in a sense, in a very primitive, simplistic way, that's true. And that's one of the reasons why we were very lucky to be founded in the time of these extraordinary geniuses like James Madison, who believed in turning ambition against ambition to try to figure out a way to balance power against power, to have something that actually can best protect the freedom of individuals and freedom of society. That is special. That is worth defending. That
Yeah.
is beautiful and compelling. But if we're teaching it, but if we're not teaching it, it won't survive.
That's a really good point. I'm afraid that there's such a lack of understanding of I mean, I wish courses could be taught in high schools, junior high schools, just on the First Amendment,
Yeah.
the power of that fine balance that's articulated just in the First Amendment. Because it seems in so many of my conversations that there's just this general lack of understanding of what that balance actually is.
Yeah.
I got to ask you the TPNR question, which is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, and you're in the thick of it, man, every
Yeah.
day. Share
Yeah.
space with, have better conversations with, nurture relationships with people across our differences. So people who get their news from different sources from we do than we do, different beliefs and backgrounds than we do. How can we do better at this talking politics and religion without killing each other thing, or is it even possible?
Oh, I think it's very possible. And one way you do it is you put on your anthropologist hat. You put on the part of you that is just really curious. And that essentially you like. I think sometimes my colleague Angel Eduardo has this term star manning. He like it's like going beyond steel manning. Um,
I
and,
like it.
and and to me, like the way I've always interpreted that is like looking at human beings as if you were a visitor from another planet and just being fascinated by them and wanting to know what makes them tick and why, and how they came to those things. So curiosity is the cure for so many of these ills, and just genuinely wanting to know. So when you actually hear someone's background story about why they came to a decision or a belief that you think is objectionable, trying to find out why and what their rationale is without thinking primarily about how you'll persuade them that they're wrong. It's just the first step is listening, is trying
Mm,
to figure out where someone is actually coming from, and hopefully you'll do the same for you. I,
yeah.
I remember I remember I was at the Root Strikers conference, and I was a moderator, and I hate being a moderator. But I had this group. There was a black preacher on it. There was another more people to the left, and there was this one white dude from Kentucky. And it was this, and I didn't do a great job moderating, and it started getting very angry. Like the panel was very angry about Trump, and the guy from Kentucky hadn't spoken. And I finally brought him into the conversation, and all he said was he just kind of like was like, Listen, like you talked about, I'm not a fan of the man either, talking about Trump, but I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. I live in a small town in Kentucky that used to have 1,200 mining jobs just maybe 10 years ago. We now have 400.
Mm,
And everybody went, oh. It was one of these moments where everybody, like, it just shifted our perspectives. Like, oh, God, yeah. Like,
yeah.
that's, and you can have moments like that, just really understanding where someone's coming from or what brought them to the moment that they're at with the curiosity, with genuine curiosity. And
Yeah.
if you can add compassion to it too, that's great.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's the bonus. You said something earlier when you were talking about your background that folks were telling you should be a lawyer because you like arguing, and you're like, no, I really don't. I'm passionate about these, and me too. I'm passionate about these issues, but it's come into really stark attention for me. Several incidents this week where folks have approached me with their dukes up immediately because they think that I'm the guy that they're going to debate with and they're going to, gun for. And I'm having to clarify again and again, like, I'm really interested in the conversation. I'm a lot less interested in the contest.
Yeah.
I want to understand you. I want to understand how you got there. Anyway, I guess that's a good tee up for almost the last question, which is, do you have any questions for me?
My question is always, how dare you?
Oh, that's great. Okay. We'll just leave that there. That's a rhetorical one, right? Okay. So do you want me to answer that?
Oh, yeah. I would love to hear an answer to that.
Let's see.
Go on.
I don't even know how to answer that. How dare I?
Yeah, that's why it's great.
Yeah, it is great. Well, there are organizations that are doing this in different ways. My dear friend Liz Joyner, who's been doing the Village Square for almost 20 years, trying to get, red and blue together, Republicans and Democrats together over coffee or beer or dinner or whatever, and figuring out how to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And Braver Angels is becoming coming to more prominence. But I they're really formal. But my exercise, number one, is trying to figure out how to do it better for me. Like
Uh-huh.
I suck at it. And man, I have what could arguably be called psychotic breaks at times. That's how bad I am at it.
I
So
understand.
I need to get better at it. But also, it's maybe the stuff that I'm pursuing is less in the formal settings, and the salons or what have you, and more just at the bar.
Yeah.
You know, I want to figure out how to do it better there.
Yeah.
So
Well, and one of the things I think someone, talked about was, like how do you have these hard conversations? And I can't remember who wrote it, but there's been variety of versions of this. Like, well, in some cases, how about you just talk about, your lives?
yeah,
Like talk about what TV you like. Like it's okay to be friends with people and
yeah,
not talk about politics all the
that's
time.
right. Yeah, that's right.
I think we took that for granted when we were younger, that you didn't have to talk politics all the time.
Well, there is something to be said for that because I think there's a tendency com- to define someone by one data point, literally
Yeah,
one data point,
yeah,
and that is what box they checked at the top of their ballot. Because even when we are talking about politics, somebody said, "Well, who'd you vote for?" I'm like, "Well, which part? you know,
yeah,
which proposition at my state level, local? Like, what are we talking about here?" So even on the ballot, we assume
yeah.
that one thing is definitive, right? So before we do wrap up, I want you to tell me about authoritarians in the academy. We talked about
Yes.
defending my enemy, but tell me about your colleagues are up to some good.
Yeah. So Sarah McLaughlin at Fire, she's the person on staff whose job is mostly to deal with the international picture when it comes to freedom of speech. And we gave her a like a book leave to work on a book that was specifically about how, particularly China and Qatar and some other countries, use their influence to limit free speech on American campuses.
Mm,
And they do this through a variety of means. Probably the ugliest mean is that if you are, say, a Chinese national in the United States, and you, God forbid, attend a meeting where someone, says free Tibet, the Chinese authorities, might pay your family a visit, for example. And so the book is just full of examples of how people bow to pressure, and particularly campuses bow to pressure from China and from other powerful, wealthy, authoritarian states. The And then, of course, there's the really embarrassing examples involving like the NBA or Hollywood, bowing the knee to make sure that Taiwan essentially like doesn't exist in any movie.
mm, wow. Well, that's good. I'll be sure to link that. I'm taking a note right now in the show notes so folks can find it.
Great.
Speaking of how to find it, how can we follow you? There's this great comic book called The Eternally Radical Idea. No, just kidding. It's a great Substack actually that looks like a
Thanks.
comic book with that deals with very, very serious subjects. So how can we find all that and track with the work of Fire and all the great work that you're doing?
Well, first, the eternally radical idea, is where you get more of like my actual personality because like that's my personal Substack.
Okay.
And some things where I talk about things beyond Fire's free speech work. But
Who's doing the illustration for you, by the way? It's really good stuff.
oh, we do. The Adam Goldstein is maybe the main one who does it, and it is AI. We take flack for like stop using AI like that. I'm like, listen, we're trying to do comic book art quickly. Like there's no other way we could do this. We're not Rockefellers. We can't just hire someone right away.
That's our next conversation. I have strong feelings about that, but
Yeah.
I'm human in and human out. I'm okay with,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And
Yeah.
and so and today's one, and Adam really took the oar on this. Is I think the title is something like, yes, the free speech situation really is that bad in the UK. And we had we crack a lot of jokes in it,
Yeah.
more than we usually do. But then just the fire.org. And what Fire needs are the kind of principled people who, because if you just care about your own side getting in trouble, at some point you're probably going to get mad at Fire because we take on right and left without fear or favor, and we lose donors if they're the kind who just care if you're attacking the other side. You're defending. If you're not defending their side, they don't care.
Yeah.
We're not your cup of tea. But if you genuinely get that we need freedom of speech for everybody, then we need you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is great. I'm so glad to catch up with you again, Greg. We certainly covered a lot. Is there anything important we haven't discussed you want to add before we close?
Let me think. Fantastic Four was a great movie. It really was a tribute to those first 100 miraculous comic books involving Jack Kirby, the great late great Jack Kirby and Stan Lee.
Excellent. I'm glad I asked. Well, seriously, Greg, thanks so much for coming back. Thank Perry for helping to set it up.
Oh, of course, yeah, he's the
He's
best.
super helpful. And yeah, I hope we do it again. I'll have to take you out for beers and see if we could do this even better.
Absolutely. Take care.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write that review, and now you can watch these conversations on YouTube. It's youtube.com/at politics and religion. I am at Corey S. Nathan at Corey S as in Sam Nathan on all the socials, as well as Substack. Doing a lot there these days. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect. And have a great week.